Close your eyes for a moment and listen, not to the hum of your devices or the noise of the modern world, but to a different kind of sound entirely. Imagine the echoing stone walls of a vast cathedral, the flicker of candlelight, and a single, haunting melody rising into the air. This is the sound of Gregorian chant, one of the most powerful and enduring musical traditions from the Middle Ages. But what if I told you that this music was never just about prayer or beauty? What if these ancient harmonies held the power to heal the sick, topple kings, and shape the very soul of an era? We often think of medieval music as something distant and decorative, background noise for historical dramas or dusty manuscripts. But in reality, music in the Middle Ages was a living, breathing force. It was prescribed by physicians to cure melancholy and physical pain. It was sung in town squares to mock corrupt leaders and inspire uprisings, and it thundered through royal courts, proclaiming the glory and divine authority of monarchs. This was a time when melody could mend a broken spirit, give voice to the powerless, and display unimaginable splendor, all with the same set of notes. In this video, we're going to journey deep into the heart of this forgotten soundscape. We'll explore how music served as medicine in monastic infirmaries, as protest on the lips of rebels, and as propaganda in the halls of power. We'll meet the people who made this music: monks, minstrels, troubadours, and even ordinary men and women, and discover how their songs still echo in our world today. Because understanding medieval music isn't just about history, it's about recognizing how sound shapes our lives, how it comforts us, unites us, and sometimes even changes us. So, if you're ready to hear the Middle Ages in a whole new way, let's begin. To truly grasp the immense power music held in the medieval world, we first need to step out of our own noisy reality and into theirs. Imagine a day without the constant hum of electricity, the rumble of engines, or the digital pings of notifications. The medieval soundscape was instead defined by the rhythms of nature and community. The crowing of a rooster at dawn, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant bells from the monastery calling the hours, the chatter in the marketplace, this was the daily soundtrack. In this environment, human-created music wasn't just entertainment. It was a profound and purposeful interruption of the ordinary. It demanded attention. It signaled something significant: a prayer, a celebration, a warning, or a call to arms. This is why its impact was so immediate and so potent. When music began, everyone listened. The instruments that created these sounds were as varied as their purposes. In the great stone churches, the deep, resonant tones of the pipe organ, a marvel of engineering for its time, would fill the vast space, intended to inspire awe and represent the voice of the divine. In more intimate settings, like a lord's hall or a village gathering, you might hear the delicate, intricate melodies of a harp or a lute, instruments associated with storytelling, courtly love, and refined entertainment. For the common people, there were simpler, more robust instruments: the recorder, the bagpipe with its droning buzz, or the percussion of tambourines and drums that provided the heartbeat for dancing and communal festivals. Each instrument carried its own social meaning, instantly communicating the context and status of the performance. Crucially, music was not a standalone art form to be enjoyed in a concert hall. It was seamlessly woven into the very fabric of daily existence. It was integrated into worship, with Gregorian chant forming the core of the liturgical day. It was part of work, with field laborers singing rhythmic songs to coordinate their planting and harvesting, making the toil more bearable and efficient. And it was essential to warfare, where trumpets and drums issued commands across the chaotic noise of the battlefield, directing armies and bolstering courage. Music was a utility, a spiritual practice, and a social glue all at once. This constant integration meant that people were acoustically literate in a way we might not be today. They understood the subtle messages and emotional cues embedded in every melody and rhythm. They believed that music was a direct channel to God, to their neighbors, and to their own inner selves. This foundational belief in music's inherent power is the key that unlocks our understanding of how a melody could mend a broken body, fuel a rebellion, or crown a king. Now, imagine you are unwell in the 14th century. Your options are limited. A physician might bleed you with leeches or prescribe a poultice of strange herbs. But he might also write you a very different kind of prescription, a song. In an era where our modern understanding of germs and anatomy was centuries away, medieval medicine operated on a completely different principle, the concept of balance. And one of the most trusted tools to restore that balance wasn't found in a jar, but in the air. Music was considered a powerful, legitimate, and often first-line treatment for a vast array of ailments, from a broken heart to a feverish body. This wasn't mere superstition. It was built on a sophisticated, if ultimately incorrect, medical framework that viewed the human being as a microcosm of the universe itself. The entire system was governed by the ancient theory of the four humors. Physicians believed that our health depended on a perfect equilibrium of four vital fluids within the body: blood, which was hot and moist; phlegm, cold and moist; yellow bile, hot and dry; and black bile, cold and dry. An excess or deficit of any one humor would lead to specific physical and emotional illnesses. An overabundance of black bile, for instance, was thought to cause melancholy, what we might call depression, making a person sluggish, sad, and introspective. A surplus of blood could lead to a manic, feverish state. The goal of any treatment was to coax these humors back into harmony, and this is where music entered the healer's toolkit. Just as certain foods and herbs had heating, cooling, drying, or moistening properties, so too did music. Specific modes, which are like ancient scales, and types of melodies were believed to possess these same elemental qualities and could directly influence the body's internal climate. A healer would carefully diagnose the patient's imbalance and then select the musical remedy accordingly. For a patient suffering from a lethargic, cold, and damp condition linked to an excess of phlegm, the treatment might involve invigorating, heating music. This could be the strong, rhythmic beating of a drum or the bright, cheerful melodies of a pipe, designed to literally warm the spirits and get the blood moving again. Conversely, a person afflicted with a hot, dry imbalance, perhaps a fever or a state of intense agitation and anger associated with too much yellow bile, would be treated with cooling, moistening music. The gentle, soothing plucks of a harp or the serene, flowing harmonies of a quiet vocal ensemble were prescribed to calm the fiery passions and restore a sense of cool tranquility. The music was a form of oral pharmacology, a precise dosage of sound designed to create a specific physiological effect. We have remarkable accounts from medieval texts that attest to the faith people placed in this practice. One famous story tells of a king so consumed by a deep, unmovable sadness that he refused to eat or speak. Physicians were baffled. Then a minstrel was called. He did not play a complex, learned piece, but a simple, heartfelt melody that he knew spoke of joy and remembrance. As the story goes, the music reached the king where words could not, slowly drawing him out of his stupor and back to himself. Whether these recoveries were miraculous, placebo-driven, or simply the result of the powerful emotional connection we all have to music, they were very real to the people of the Middle Ages. They saw music not as a separate entertainment, but as a genuine healing force that operated in the space between spiritual comfort and physical remedy, mending the soul as a pathway to mending the body. This medieval approach reveals a holistic view of health that modern science, in many ways, is only just beginning to rediscover. Today, we have the growing field of music therapy, which uses evidence-based musical interventions to address physical, emotional, and cognitive needs. We understand now that music can lower cortisol levels, reduce blood pressure, and release endorphins. While we've replaced the theory of the four humors with neurochemistry, the underlying principle remains strikingly similar. That sound, organized into meaningful patterns, has a profound and measurable impact on our biological and psychological well-being. The medieval physicians and monks were, in their own way, early pioneers of this idea, recognizing that true healing often requires treating the whole person, body, mind, and spirit, with music serving as one of the most beautiful and unifying medicines ever known. Within the secluded walls of medieval monasteries, the practice of healing was a sacred art that blended prayer, botany, and acoustics into a single, holistic regimen. These religious communities were not just spiritual havens, they were the hospitals and medical schools of their age, where the infirm came seeking care for both body and soul. And among their most trusted and fascinating remedies was the deliberate, disciplined use of Gregorian chant. This was not a casual performance, it was a precise medical prescription, administered with the same solemnity as a herbal tincture or a prayer. The monks operated on a profound belief that the root of physical illness often lay in a spiritual disharmony, a soul out of tune with the perfect, divine order of the universe. Their treatment aimed to retune the patient using the most powerful tuning fork they possessed, the human voice raised in sacred song. Gregorian chant, with its characteristic monophonic texture, a single, unaccompanied melodic line, was considered the ideal sonic medicine. The unison vocals, sung in a pure, resonant tone, were believed to embody the very sound of celestial harmony. There were no complex harmonies or competing rhythms to create tension or distraction. Instead, the clean, soaring melody was thought to act as a direct channel, a vibrational bridge between the earthly and the divine. By listening to or participating in this chant, a patient was essentially allowing their own internal rhythm, their own disordered humors, to synchronize with this perfect heavenly frequency. This realignment of the soul was the first and most crucial step toward physical recovery. It was a form of spiritual acupuncture, using sound waves instead of needles to restore the proper flow of energy and balance within a person. The application of this sonic therapy was remarkably specific and disciplined, documented in monastic rules and medical manuscripts that read like ancient pharmacopoeias. For a brother suffering from insomnia and restless nights, the prescribed treatment might involve listening to the gentle, maternal strains of the Salve Regina, a chant dedicated to the Virgin Mary, known for its soothing, melodic contours that could ease a troubled mind into restful sleep. For a patient burning with fever considered a hot and dry ailment, the choir master might select a different chant altogether, one with a slower, more cooling and solemn character, intended to literally lower the patient's internal heat. The duration and timing of these musical doses were often carefully considered, sometimes performed at specific hours of the divine office to harness the particular spiritual energy of that time of day. This chant therapy was almost never used in isolation. It was part of a multisensory healing experience designed to engage every facet of the patient's being. The chanting would be accompanied by the soft glow of candlelight, the fragrant smoke of purifying incense, the tactile presence of a healing poultice, and the unwavering support of communal prayer. This created an environment utterly dedicated to recovery, where every sight, smell, sound, and sensation was orchestrated to promote peace and wellness. The monks, through centuries of quiet observation, had developed a deep, intuitive understanding of something modern science now confirms: that repetitive, meditative sound can dramatically alter our brainwave patterns, guide us into deep states of relaxation, and activate the body's innate self-healing capabilities. They were masters of creating a therapeutic soundscape, using the disciplined power of their own voices to craft an atmosphere where fear could subside and the body's natural resilience could take over. Yet for all its power to heal, music in the Middle Ages possessed a sharp, double edge. The very same melodies that could soothe a fevered brow could also stir a crowd to righteous anger. In the hands of the common people, music transformed from a balm into a weapon, a tool of protest that gave a voice to those who were otherwise silenced by the rigid structures of feudal society. Imagine the frustration of a peasant, burdened by crippling taxes demanded by a distant lord and a tithe taken by the local church. He couldn't write a polemic to be published. He was likely illiterate. He couldn't stand up in a court and argue his case. He had no legal standing, but he could sing. And so, in taverns, in fields, and in the streets, a different kind of medicine was being brewed, not to cure an individual's melancholy, but to treat the sickness of a whole society festering under injustice. This was the birth of the protest song, a tradition of musical dissent that is as alive today as it was 700 years ago. The genius of these musical rebels lay in their methods of disguise. Direct criticism of the powerful was a dangerous game, punishable by imprisonment, mutilation, or worse. So, the people developed a clever and subtle musical language to voice their grievances. Satire and allegory became their primary tools. A ballad that seemed on the surface to tell a simple folk tale about a greedy fox could, to a knowing ear, be a blistering critique of a corrupt bishop who preyed on his flock. A festive carol sung during the rowdy celebrations of Carnival, when the normal social rules were temporarily suspended, might feature lyrics where the world was turned upside down, where the peasant was king and the nobleman his servant. This temporary inversion of the hierarchy wasn't just for laughs. It was a pressure valve, allowing people to articulate their deepest frustrations under the safe cover of holiday merriment and humor. It was a way to say the unsayable, to plant seeds of dissent in the fertile ground of shared laughter and song. We have surviving examples of this musical resistance that offer a heartbreaking window into the medieval mind. One of the most powerful is the Song of the Husbandman, composed in England around the turn of the 14th century. It doesn't call for revolution in screaming tones. Instead, it offers a poet's lament, a weary sigh set to music. The song is written from the perspective of a simple farmer, a husbandman, who details in plaintive verse how his hard work is utterly devoured by taxes and fees. He speaks of the king's tax collectors, the greed of the church, and the local officials who all take their share, leaving him and his family with nothing but straw. The song's power isn't in a rousing chorus, but in its quiet, devastating detail. It doesn't just complain about being poor. It methodically documents the machinery of his oppression, giving a collective voice to a universal experience of hardship. When sung from village to village, this song did more than just share a sad story. It built solidarity. It told every listener, "You are not alone in your suffering. Your pain is my pain." That sense of shared identity was the essential first step toward any form of collective action. This musical dissent was fiercely oral and communal by necessity. These songs weren't written down in expensive songbooks for the aristocracy. They were memorized, passed from mouth to mouth, and adapted to local issues. A minstrel traveling between towns could act as a news service, carrying a song about a tax protest in one county to another region where people faced similar struggles. In an age before newspapers or mass communication, this was how ideas traveled and movements found their footing. The music provided a simple, memorable melody that made complex political grievances easy to learn and impossible to forget. A crowd could unite behind a song in a way they couldn't behind a speech. The melody made the message sticky, infectious, and powerful. In this way, a simple tune became a potent organizing tool, proving that the right song, sung at the right time, could indeed be sharper and more dangerous than any sword. It was a weapon that could not be easily confiscated and whose wounds, the ideas it planted in the minds of the people, were invisible to the authorities trying to suppress them. But the theoretical power of protest songs became terrifyingly real in the spring of 1381, when England erupted into the largest popular uprising it had ever seen. The Peasants' Revolt was a firestorm of long simmering grievances, a poll tax that bled the poor dry, the lasting social upheaval from the Black Death, and the entrenched oppression of the feudal system. And this fire was fed by music. The rebels didn't just march, they sang. Their movement had a soundtrack, a collection of anthems that turned a scattered collection of angry individuals from different villages and trades into a unified, purposeful army with a shared voice. This was music stripped of all subtlety and allegory. It was a direct, thunderous declaration of intent. At the heart of this musical rebellion was a fiery preacher named John Ball. While he couldn't travel to every village himself, his radical sermons and letters could, and they were often set to simple, catchy tunes that transformed complex ideas of social justice into something anyone could remember and sing. One of his most famous couplets, a line from a letter that was almost certainly sung as a rallying cry, asked a revolutionary question: when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? This was a theological bombshell set to music. It used the story of Genesis to argue that the entire feudal hierarchy, the idea that some men were born nobles and others were born to serve them, was a man-made corruption of a world God had originally created equal. Set to a familiar melody, this idea became a viral slogan centuries before the concept existed. A peasant humming this tune while working in the field wasn't just passing the time. He was quietly repeating a radical challenge to the very foundation of his world, reinforcing a new identity for himself and his neighbors, not as subordinates, but as equals wrongfully denied their rights. As the revolt gained momentum and thousands began to march from Kent and Essex towards London, the true strategic power of this music revealed itself. Eyewitness chroniclers of the time, often monks who were horrified by the uprising, nonetheless recorded the chilling sound of the approaching mob. They didn't describe a disorganized rabble, but a disciplined force moving to the rhythm of their own songs. Imagine the scene, a vast column of men and women, armed with scythes and bows, their footsteps pounding in time with the rhythm of their singing. The air would have been filled with the sound of their collective voice, a deep, rolling wave of sound that announced their arrival long before they came into view. For the rebels, this singing was a powerful tool for morale. It alleviated the fear and exhaustion of the long march. It created a sense of intoxicating camaraderie and shared purpose, binding together weavers, farmers, and blacksmiths into a single body with a single will. For the nobility and the wealthy merchants huddled behind London's gates, that same sound was utterly terrifying. That chorus was the sound of their world ending. It was the sound of a system that had placed them at the top for centuries, now screaming its refusal from the bottom. The music was a psychological weapon, broadcasting their unity and resolve far more effectively than any spoken threat. This wasn't an organic, spontaneous outburst of song. It was a deliberate and brilliantly effective strategy of mobilization. The rebels understood that music could do what speeches could not. It could cross the barriers of local dialect and personal suspicion to create instant solidarity. A man from Kent might not fully understand the accent of a man from Essex, but they could both sing the same tune with the same angry conviction. The songs provided a simple, shared script for the rebellion. They codified its grievances and its goals in an easily transmissible format. Before the march even began, these ballads had been circulating in taverns and market squares, acting as an invitation and a call to arms, setting the date and spreading the plan under the very noses of the authorities who likely dismissed them as mere rustic entertainment. The music was the recruitment poster, the marching orders, and the battle standard all rolled into one. It demonstrated an incredible capacity to take raw, undirected anger and channel it into focused, historic action, proving that a melody could indeed be the spark that lit a fire capable of shaking a kingdom to its core. While the common people used music as a tool of protest, the aristocracy wielded it as an instrument of absolute control. If rebel songs were a dagger in the dark, royal music was a jeweled scepter held high for all to see, and more importantly, to hear. For a medieval monarch, power was not just about owning land and commanding armies. It was about perception. It was about crafting an image of such overwhelming, God-given authority that the very idea of challenging it seemed unthinkable. And there was no more effective tool for this than a grand, strategically deployed soundtrack. Every coronation, every feast, every diplomatic meeting was transformed into a multi-sensory spectacle, and music was the invisible force that elevated these events from mere ceremonies into awe-inspiring assertions of dominance. The goal was to create a sonic atmosphere so rich, so complex, and so magnificent that it left visitors and subjects alike with a single, undeniable impression that they were in the presence of a power that was both temporally supreme and divinely ordained. To achieve this, royal courts became the most prestigious musical employers of the age, assembling what were essentially the first professional orchestras. A king's musical household was a significant and expensive investment, a clear signal of his immense wealth. The size and quality of his ensemble of minstrels, which could include everything from soft-voiced lute players and harpists for intimate chamber music to loud, brilliant trumpeters and percussionists for outdoor events, were a direct reflection of his status. When a foreign ambassador arrived for an audience, his reception began not with words but with sound. He would be led through palace halls accompanied by a stately processional, the music growing gradually richer and more complex as he neared the throne room, building a sense of anticipation and reverence. Upon entering, he would be greeted by a fanfare from silver trumpets, a sound so piercing and brilliant it was legally restricted to royalty and nobility in many places. To hear it was to acknowledge their supreme rank. The entire experience was a carefully orchestrated psychological campaign, designed to overwhelm the senses and put the visitor at a disadvantage before a single word of negotiation was even spoken. The music itself was engineered to showcase not just power but sophistication. This is where composers like the famed Guillaume de Machaut entered the picture. Serving as a court composer for the King of Bohemia and later John, Duke of Normandy, Machaut was a master of the complex, innovative style known as polyphony music, with multiple, independent melodic lines woven together in an intricate tapestry of sound. To the medieval ear, this was the height of intellectual and artistic achievement. A complex motet by Machaut wasn't just pleasant to listen to, it was a dazzling display of mathematical precision, compositional genius, and cultural refinement. By commissioning and performing such works, a patron like John of Bohemia was making a bold statement. He was declaring that his court was not a mere center of military might, but a beacon of culture and learning. It sent a message to rival courts: we possess not only the strength to defeat you in battle, but the sophistication to outshine you in art. Our power is total. The music was a form of soft power, a cultural arms race where the weapon was beauty and complexity. This auditory propaganda extended to every corner of court life. A royal feast was a symphony of controlled opulence. Musicians would perform from a high gallery, their music drifting down over the assembled nobles as they dined on extravagant dishes. The songs, often dealing with themes of chivalry, heroic conquest, and idealized love, constantly reinforced the values and mythology that supported the aristocratic hierarchy. Even the act of dining had its own soundtrack, with specific fanfares announcing the arrival of each new course, transforming a meal into a ceremonial progression. On the tournament field, music played a different but equally vital role. The thunder of drums and the blare of trumpets were not just for excitement. They were the battlefield communication system, directing the movements of knights and their retainers in the chaotic mock combat. The music here emphasized military discipline, coordination, and sheer might, a public rehearsal of the kingdom's readiness for war. In essence, a medieval monarch understood that to control the soundscape was to control the narrative. The rebellious rhythms of the peasantry were unpredictable, emerging from taverns and fields, but royal music was meticulously composed, rehearsed, and performed on command. It was a constant, repeating loop of self-glorification that left no room for alternative messages within the walls of power. Every chord, every fanfare, every complex polyphonic cascade was a building block in the architecture of their authority, meant to cement their place at the top of the social order by appealing not to logic, but to emotion and awe. It was the ultimate propaganda, written not on fragile parchment, but in the very air itself, resonating in the bones of everyone who heard it and leaving them with the unquestionable feeling that they were in the presence of something truly grand, eternal, and right. Of all the moments in a monarch's life, none was more critical than the coronation. This was not merely a political ceremony or a change of administration. It was a sacred metamorphosis, a moment where a mortal man or woman was ritually transformed into God's own representative on earth. And every step of this profound transformation was underscored, guided, and elevated by a powerful and meticulously curated musical score. The music was not decorative, it was operational, a vital component of the ritual machinery that made a king. It provided the sacred acoustics through which divine grace was believed to flow, channeling heavenly authority directly onto the shoulders of the new ruler and making that authority audible, tangible, and utterly undeniable to everyone present. The musical centerpiece of this sacred theater was often the Laudes Regii, or the royal praises. This was far more than a simple hymn of celebration. It was a sonic coronation in its own right, a liturgical map of power set to music. Sung in Latin by a trained choir of clerics, the Laudes Regii was a lengthy, elaborate chant that invoked the blessings of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and all the saints upon the new monarch. But its most fascinating feature was its political specificity. Woven into the fabric of its sacred verses was a detailed, sung catalogue of the king's territories, a literal listing of the duchies, counties, and provinces he now claimed to rule. As the choir sang the names of these lands, Normandy, Aquitaine, Anjou, they were not just listing assets, they were acoustically mapping the extent of his sovereignty, proclaiming his God-given right to rule each and every one of those places. For the assembled nobility, many of whom owed their own power to these very lands, Hearing their titles and territories embedded within this sacred music was a powerful reminder of their place within this new divine order. The music bound them to the king not just by feudal oath, but by a shared, sung invocation of God's will. The instruments chosen for the ceremony were equally symbolic, each adding a distinct layer to this multisensory assertion of power. The human voice of the choir, pure and unaccompanied in the Gregorian sections, represented the spiritual and intellectual authority of the Church, which was an essential partner in this sacred compact. Then came the deep, resonant tones of the pipe organ, an instrument of immense cost and technical complexity. Its powerful vibrations were felt in the chest as much as heard by the ear, a physical sensation that symbolized the overwhelming, awe-inspiring weight of royal power itself. Finally, cutting through all of this were the brilliant, piercing fanfares of trumpets. In an age before electronic amplification, the trumpet was the loudest sound most people would ever hear. Its clear, sharp call was legally restricted to royalty and high nobility. To sound it was to announce the presence of supreme authority. At the coronation's climax, as the crown was placed upon the sovereign's head, these trumpets would blast, their triumphant notes echoing through the cathedral. This was the sound of the transformation completing, a heavenly announcement that a new power was now active in the world. The combination was masterful. The divine voice of the choir, the awe-inspiring power of the organ, and the triumphant military authority of the trumpets. Together, they created an overwhelming auditory experience designed to convince every single witness, from the highest duke to the lowest servant, that they were not just watching a political event, but witnessing a miracle. This careful orchestration turned the coronation from a simple transfer of power into a transcendent experience. The goal was to overwhelm the senses and bypass rational skepticism, appealing directly to emotion and faith. The shimmer of candlelight on gold vestments, the fragrant haze of incense, the physical weight of the crown, and above all, the enveloping wall of sacred sound, all of it worked in concert to create a state of collective awe. In this heightened emotional state, the incredible claim being made that this ordinary person was now a divine vessel became not just believable but felt. The music was the key that unlocked this collective suspension of disbelief. It convinced the audience long before any laws were passed or battles were fought, constructing the king's legitimacy in the hearts and minds of his subjects through the sheer, irresistible power of sound. In the echoing stone vaults of a medieval cathedral, music didn't just celebrate power, it consecrated it, making the crown itself ring with a note of divine approval that would resonate throughout the entire reign. But while kings used music to build walls of power, and rebels used it to tear them down, there was another group of musicians who learned to dance nimbly along the top of those very walls, using melody as a tool of delicate social negotiation. In the sun-drenched courts of Occitania, what is now the south of France, a remarkable cultural movement blossomed, giving rise to the Troubadours and, in a stunning break from tradition, their female counterparts, the Troubadours. These were not simple minstrels performing for coin. They were poet-composers, often of noble birth themselves, who turned the aristocratic court into a stage for a complex game of words and music. Their chosen theme was finema, or refined love, a highly stylized code of romantic admiration and chivalric devotion. On the surface, their songs were all about the pining of a lowly knight for an unattainable, idealized lady. But just beneath that polished surface, these compositions became a surprisingly flexible language for navigating the treacherous waters of court politics, offering praise, issuing veiled criticism, and even carving out a space for powerful personal expression within a rigidly structured world. The genius of the troubadour's art was its inherent ambiguity, a double meaning baked into the very structure of Finema. A song that seemed to be a straightforward lament about a lover's coldness could, with a slight shift in context or a knowing glance from the performer, transform into a witty commentary on a patron's stinginess or a rival's foolishness. The language of love became a safe metaphor for the language of power. A line about a lady who withholds her favor might actually be a complaint about a lord who is slow to grant a land title or a promised position. By framing political discontent within the accepted conventions of a love song, a troubadour could deliver a sharp critique without ever appearing disrespectful or treasonous. It was a game everyone at court understood, a dance of insinuation and interpretation where the melody provided a pleasant disguise for messages that might otherwise be dangerous to speak aloud. This allowed these artists to serve as a unique kind of courtly feedback mechanism, reflecting the concerns and tensions of the aristocracy back to them in a coded, artistic form that was palatable and even entertaining. This artistic innovation becomes even more extraordinary when we consider the Troubadours, the women who dared to enter this predominantly male domain. In a society that severely limited female voice and agency, the act of composing and performing a song was a radical assertion of intellect and identity. The most famous among them, the Countess Beatrice de Dyer, left us with a small but breathtaking body of work that completely upends the traditional dynamics of courtly love. In her most famous song, A Chanta emer de so quiu no volria, I must sing of that which I wish I did not, she does not posture as a passive, distant object of affection. Instead, she is the narrator, the active subject of her own story, expressing her own desire, her intelligence, and her frustration with a lover who has been unfaithful. She sings not of wistful longing, but of a very specific grievance, declaring, I should like to hold my knight naked in my arms one evening. This is a stunningly direct claim to female desire and autonomy, a world away from the passive female figures who populated most troubadour songs. Through their artistry, the Troubadours claimed a voice. They used the established framework of Finema not to praise male patrons, but to explore their own interior lives, to negotiate the complexities of their own relationships, and to challenge the very gender norms that sought to silence them. Their songs are filled with a palpable sense of wit, irony, and emotional authenticity that often feels more modern than medieval. They argue, they plead, they boast of their own worth, and they demand reciprocity in love and respect. In doing so, they transformed the courtly song from a one-sided performance of admiration into a potential dialogue, a medium for personal and political negotiation that acknowledged the existence of female intellect and passion. The legacy of the Troubadours and Troubadours is a powerful testament to music's subtle power. They operated in the most constrained of environments, the hierarchical, watchful world of the medieval aristocracy, and yet they found a way to use melody and poetry to say the unsayable. Their work demonstrates that music is never just entertainment. It is a sophisticated language, a social lubricant, and a political tool. It can reinforce the status quo with grand fanfares, but it can also, as these Occitan poets proved, whisper sly secrets in the ear of power, challenge social conventions from within, and grant a voice to those whom history often tries to forget. In their elegant, nuanced songs, we find a timeless truth that sometimes the most revolutionary act is not a shouted demand, but a beautifully sung question. Yet for every call to holy war, there was eventually an echo of disillusionment. As the initial fervor of the Crusades faded into the grim reality of prolonged conflict, a very different kind of music began to emerge from those who had witnessed the horrors firsthand. Returning soldiers, weary and traumatized, and critical clerics who questioned the mounting bloodshed, turned to song as a means of processing their experiences and voicing their doubts. These were not the triumphant hymns of the clergy, but the raw, often satirical ballads of the common man, offering a strikingly nuanced and deeply human perspective on these so-called holy campaigns. This musical counter-narrative became a vital outlet for the moral ambiguity that official proclamations tried to suppress. One of the most poignant examples comes from the aftermath of the disastrous Children's Crusade of 1212, a tragic episode where thousands of young people set out for the Holy Land only to meet with disaster, many being captured and sold into slavery. In the wake of this catastrophe, lamentations and sorrowful ballads spread across Europe, not celebrating martyrdom but mourning a profound loss of innocence and questioning the wisdom of the elders who had allowed such a thing to happen. These songs gave voice to a public grief and a growing sense of unease about the endless cycle of violence undertaken in God's name. Similarly, the songs of the Crusaders themselves often shifted from idealism to a gritty, weary realism. The famous Palestinallied, or Palestine song, by the knight and poet Walther von der Vogelweide, is a fascinating study in this duality. It begins with the expected pious yearning to walk where Christ himself had walked, but as it progresses, the lyrics reveal a more complex sentiment, a sense of spiritual duty tangled with the immense personal cost and the harsh, alien landscape of the conflict. The most biting musical criticisms, however, were often reserved for the institutional corruption that many crusaders encountered. Satirical songs began to circulate, mocking the greed of the nobles who saw the Crusades as a chance for land and plunder rather than salvation. Other ballads targeted the hypocrisy of the church itself, pointing out the stark contrast between the preached ideals of poverty and charity and the immense wealth and political ambition on display among certain bishops and papal legates in the East. This musical dissent was dangerous, of course, but it was powerful precisely because it was set to a catchy tune. A clever satire could be memorized and hummed, spreading a critical idea far more effectively and discreetly than any written tract could among a largely illiterate population. These songs became a safe, communal way to process collective trauma and express the doubts that faith alone could not resolve. This stark contrast in musical expression reveals the full spectrum of the human experience during the Crusades. On one side, the rigid, unifying beats of war drums and the soaring certainty of hymns like Vexilla Regis, designed to forge an army and reinforce an absolute ideology. On the other, the complex, mournful, and often discordant melodies of the returning soldier and the critical thinker, grappling with fear, loss, and moral compromise. One type of music sought to simplify reality into a binary battle of good versus evil, while the other held space for the uncomfortable shades of gray. Together, they present a complete and heartbreakingly human soundscape of holy war, proving that music was not just a tool for propaganda, but also a mirror for conscience, capable of both rallying our army to conquest and giving voice to its deepest, most troubling regrets. Yet, even as music was used to build community and enforce order, it held another, far more unsettling power: the ability to shatter rationality and plunge entire communities into a state of collective frenzy. The history of the Middle Ages is punctuated by bizarre and terrifying outbreaks known as dancing manias, events where the line between music's healing potential and its capacity to induce harm became dangerously blurred. Picture a town square in the Rhine Valley during the summer of 1374. Instead of the usual market chatter, the air is filled with the frantic, rhythmic driving of a drum and the shrill melody of a pipe. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of people are caught in a terrifying compulsion, their bodies jerking and spinning in a frenzied, uncontrollable dance. They dance for hours, then days, until their feet are bloody and raw, their minds gripped by an exhaustion so profound that some collapse or even die from heart failure. This was not a celebration, it was a plague of motion, a mass psychological episode where music appeared to act not as a medicine, but as a kind of contagion. These outbreaks, which flared up across Europe from the 13th to the 17th centuries, were often named after Saint Vitus or Saint John, saints who were paradoxically believed to both cause and cure the affliction. Contemporary observers, from town clerks to physicians, struggled to explain the phenomenon. Some saw it as a divine punishment, a curse cast upon the community for its sins. Others viewed it as a form of demonic possession, requiring religious intervention like exorcism, but many accounts point to a more tangible trigger: the musicians. Chroniclers describe itinerant pipers and drummers whose specific tunes seemed to possess an irresistible power, pulling people into the dance against their will. The music wasn't just accompanying the mania. In the minds of those present, it was initiating it, acting as a sonic key that unlocked a deep, primal, and collective hysterical response. The musicians themselves were often seen with a mixture of fear and awe, and in some cases, towns would actually pay them to stop playing, hoping to break the spell they were believed to have cast. Modern historians and scientists have proposed several theories to explain these tragic events, each pointing to a perfect storm of physiological and psychological stressors. One prominent theory involves ergot poisoning, a condition caused by a fungus that grows on damp rye, a dietary staple for the poor. Ergot contains chemicals similar to LSD, and ingestion can lead to convulsions, hallucinations, and a sensation of burning skin, symptoms that align with some descriptions from the time. Another theory points to the immense, unaddressed trauma of the era. These outbreaks often occurred in the wake of the Black Death, during periods of famine, or amid relentless warfare. The constant, grinding stress and the ever-present specter of a painful, arbitrary death could have created a level of mass psychological tension that finally found its release in this uncontrollable physical catharsis. The dancing may have been a desperate, unconscious form of purification, a way for the community to literally sweat out its collective anxiety and terror through exhaustive, ritualized movement. Whether the cause was chemical, psychological, or a combination of both, the dancing manias stand as a stark testament to music's profound and primal power over the human organism. This was music operating at its most fundamental level, bypassing the conscious mind entirely to speak directly to the nerves and muscles. It demonstrates that sound organized into rhythm and melody is not a passive experience. It is an active force that can synchronize heartbeats, dictate breathing, and command movement. In the right context, this power can soothe and heal, as we saw in the monastic infirmaries. But in the wrong context, under the right conditions of stress and suggestion, that same power could tip a whole population over the edge into a shared trance state, revealing a terrifying vulnerability to the very harmonies that were meant to provide comfort. The dancing manias remind us that music's ability to unite us is a double-edged sword. It can forge bonds of joyful community, but it can also fuse individuals into a single, suffering body, helpless in the grip of a rhythm that offers no rest. As medieval cities swelled with new residents drawn by trade and opportunity, the chaotic soundscape of urban life demanded a new kind of order, a structure that could harness the power of music for the community's benefit while preventing it from becoming a source of discord. This was the vital role of the musical guilds, organizations that transformed the life of a city musician from a precarious existence into a respected profession. Much like the guilds for bakers, weavers, or stonemasons, these were strict brotherhoods, complete with their own hierarchies, rigorous training programs, and rules designed to protect both the quality of the craft and the economic well-being of their members. To become a master musician in a city like Nuremberg or Frankfurt was not simply a matter of talent. It was a years-long journey of apprenticeship, from a lowly beginner learning the fundamentals to a journeyman refining his art, and finally, to a master who had to compose and perform an original piece before a panel of stern judges to earn his title. This system ensured that the music echoing through the city's streets and squares met a certain standard of excellence, preserving a cherished cultural tradition for generations. Perhaps the most famous example of this regulated musical world was the Guild of Meistersingers in Germany. The term Meister means master, and these were not mere traveling minstrels. They were often prosperous tradesmen and merchants, bakers, cobblers, blacksmiths, for whom music was a serious and revered avocation. Their gatherings were less like concerts and more like polite, yet fiercely competitive compositional contests held in local churches or guild halls. The rules they followed were astonishingly precise, governing everything from the acceptable melodic modes and rhyme schemes to the specific themes that could be explored. This strict framework, known as the tabulata, might seem creatively stifling to our modern ears, but for the Meistersingers, it was the very source of their art's dignity. They believed that true mastery was demonstrated not through wild improvisation, but through the ability to create profound beauty within established, challenging boundaries. This created a stable, self-policing musical community that was deeply integrated into the civic and social fabric of the urban middle class. Beyond these formal guilds, the everyday soundscape of a medieval city was a constant, living tapestry of music that defined the rhythm of daily life for all its inhabitants. The cries of street vendors were not just shouts but melodic announcements, each tune designed to be unique and carry over the din of the crowd, advertising fresh bread, fish, or candles. The night watchman, making his rounds through the dark, narrow streets, would sing out the hour and the state of the weather, his voice a solitary thread of melody that offered both a practical service and a comforting assurance of safety to those asleep behind shutters. Every significant civic event was marked by sound, the triumphant fanfares from the city's trumpeters high on the cathedral tower to celebrate a military victory, the solemn, slow-moving harmonies of a religious procession on a saint's day, or the lively, raucous tunes of a public festival where social norms were temporarily set aside. This shared auditory environment gave the city its unique personality and fostered a powerful sense of communal identity among its diverse residents. Yet this musical unity also subtly reinforced the city's social divisions. The grand polyphonic masses sung in the cathedral by a trained choir of men and boys were a world apart from the simple folk songs and rustic dances enjoyed in a crowded tavern near the docks. The music performed at a wealthy merchant's banquet, featuring expensive imported instruments like the lute or viol, was a clear auditory symbol of his status and refinement, inaccessible to the common laborer. The guilds themselves, while creating stability, were also instruments of control. They held a monopoly on professional music within the city walls, and they fiercely protected it. An unlicensed musician, a so-called wayfaring minstrel, could be fined or even run out of town for performing without the guild's permission. This was about economics, of course, but it was also about cultural authority. The guilds, often in collaboration with the city council, decided what music was acceptable, orderly, and beneficial for the public good. They could suppress songs deemed seditious or morally dangerous, ensuring that the city's soundtrack reinforced the established social order rather than challenging it. In this delicate balance, we see the dual nature of music in the medieval city. On one hand, it was a powerful tool for building community, marking the shared hours, seasons, and triumphs that bound people together. The guilds provided structure, quality, and a dignified livelihood for artists, embedding music deeply into the urban economy. On the other hand, this very structure made music a means of social control, a way to police boundaries, reinforce class distinctions, and suppress dissonant voices that threatened the status quo. The organized sound of the city was never just background noise. It was the audible expression of its values, its hierarchies, and its identity, a harmony carefully composed to ensure that every note, from the watchman's call to the master's song, played its part in maintaining the complex melody of urban life. Yet amidst all this carefully curated sound, from the healing chants to the rebel ballads, there existed a profound and equally powerful counterpart, the intentional, sacred use of silence. In the clamor of the medieval world, where life was often short and noisy, the most sought-after commodity for many was not more sound, but less. Within the walls of monasteries and convents, silence was not merely an absence. It was a presence, a spiritual practice as disciplined and vital as any sung prayer. The monastic day was carefully partitioned into periods of work, prayer, and sacred quiet, known as the grand silence. This was not a passive state of not speaking, but an active, receptive listening. The goal was to still the internal chatter of the mind and the external noise of the world in order to become attuned to what many mystics called the divine whisper, the subtle, quiet voice of God that could only be heard in the deepest pools of inner stillness. In this context, silence was the ultimate luxury and the highest form of reverence, a direct pathway to spiritual insight that stood in stark contrast to the boisterous, unpredictable soundscape of the world beyond the cloister. This reverence for quiet had a practical counterpart in the realm of power and control, where the restriction of certain sounds revealed society's deepest anxieties. If monastic silence was about hearing God, then worldly bans on music were often about avoiding the devil. Secular and religious authorities alike frequently issued edicts prohibiting specific types of music, dances, and instruments they deemed immoral, seditious, or simply too disruptive. The lively, rhythmic dances associated with village festivities were a common target. Church councils repeatedly condemned round dances and carols, not because they were inherently evil, but because the uninhibited communal ecstasy they could produce was seen as a gateway to sin, a loss of self-control that could lead to lust, violence, or social disorder. The bagpipe, with its droning, visceral, and often raucous sound, was particularly suspect, frequently linked to drunkenness and debauchery, and banned from many pious gatherings. These restrictions were never just about noise, they were about morality. The logic was clear: certain sounds, certain rhythms could stir the passions and lower the inhibitions, corrupting the soul by leading the body into temptation. To control the soundtrack of public life was to attempt to control the very impulses of the people. Perhaps the most revealing of these sound-based regulations were those targeting the human voice itself, particularly the voices of women. Several medieval church councils issued specific decrees prohibiting women from singing in church services. The official reasoning was often couched in a paternalistic language of protection, claiming that the melodic sweetness of the female voice might prove a distraction to male clerics and worshippers, leading their thoughts away from devotion and toward earthly desires. But this rule exposes a much deeper and more pervasive anxiety about female agency and the perceived danger of women's participation in public spiritual life. A woman's voice, raised in song, was seen as an inherently sensual and powerful instrument that could disrupt the rigidly controlled, male-dominated hierarchy of the church. It was a sound that could not be easily contained or dictated, and thus it had to be silenced. This rule demonstrates with chilling clarity that the regulation of sound was never neutral. It was a potent tool for enforcing social boundaries, gender roles, and ideological conformity. The power to decide who could sing, what could be played, and when silence must fall was ultimately the power to shape the soul of a community, defining what was holy, what was orderly, and what was truly acceptable. But just as the notes of a melody carry meaning, so too did the very instrument that produced them. In the stratified world of the Middle Ages, you weren't just what you played. The instrument itself was a badge, an immediate and unmistakable signal of your place in the social hierarchy. The sound of a particular instrument could instantly transport a listener to a smoky tavern, a sun-drenched field, a lavish court, or a soaring cathedral, each setting with its own strict rules and expectations. This wasn't just a matter of personal taste, it was a complex language of social symbolism, where the choice of instrument communicated wealth, piety, education, and even morality before a single note was ever performed. Consider the stark contrast between two of the era's most iconic instruments, the harp and the bagpipe. The harp, with its graceful, triangular frame and strings painstakingly crafted from animal gut, was the undisputed emblem of courtly refinement. Its sound was delicate, intricate, and required a quiet, attentive audience to be fully appreciated. To see a harpist in a lord's hall was to witness a display of aristocratic values, restraint, sophistication, and the luxury of leisure. Mastering the harp demanded years of dedicated training, an investment of time and resources far beyond the means of a common laborer. Its very presence in a performance whispered of a patron's wealth and cultural ambition, a sonic accessory to power as deliberate as any tapestry or piece of silver. Similarly, the lute, with its rounded body and soft, intimate voice, was the instrument of poets and lovers, perfect for accompanying the complex verses of courtly romance. It suggested a world of private chambers and refined conversation, a far cry from the boisterous energy of public spaces. On the opposite end of this social spectrum was the bagpipe. Its sound was anything but restrained, a loud, droning, reedy wail that could carry for miles across open fields. This was the heart of rustic festivity, the driving force behind village dances and seasonal celebrations. But its very power and association with uninhibited peasant revelry made the upper classes deeply suspicious. The church frequently condemned the bagpipe, linking its wild, visceral rhythms to drunkenness, lust, and a dangerous loss of self-control. It was the sound of the common folk at play, and to the ears of the nobility and clergy, that play often sounded dangerously close to rebellion. Its music was of the body, not the mind, encouraging movement and ecstasy rather than quiet contemplation, making it a perennial target for moralists who saw in its drone a threat to the established social order. Then there was the pipe organ, an instrument in a class of its own, representing not earthly nobility but divine majesty. This was the most colossal and technologically complex machine of the Middle Ages, a monumental feat of engineering involving hundreds, sometimes thousands, of pipes, intricate woodworking, and sophisticated bellows systems. The cost to build and maintain such an instrument was astronomical, affordable only to the greatest cathedrals and abbeys. Its sound was correspondingly immense, not a mere melody but a physical experience, a wall of vibration that could shake the very stones of the church and be felt deep in the chest of every worshipper. The organ didn't accompany the liturgy, it was the voice of the liturgy itself, a man-made approximation of the power and awe of the divine. To hear it was to understand the overwhelming authority of the church, an authority expressed not through words but through sheer, breathtaking sonic power. This social coding of sound had very real consequences for the musicians themselves. A minstrel who mastered the lute or harp could realistically aspire to gain patronage from a noble household, lifting himself from the precarious life of a wandering entertainer to a respected, salaried position within a court. His skill could become a ladder to a higher social standing. Conversely, a musician known primarily for the bagpipe or other low instruments might find his opportunities limited to public squares and taverns, his art dismissed as mere noise by the elite. The instrument itself became a ceiling or a catalyst for the performer's own status. This intricate system of associations means that for a medieval listener, the first sound of a performance, the clear pluck of a harp, the nasal drone of a bagpipe, or the profound blast of an organ, set the entire stage. It announced the social world of the piece, its intended audience, and its underlying message before the melody even began to unfold. The instrument was the first and most powerful word in a musical sentence, telling you exactly where you were and, just as importantly, who you were expected to be. Yet, even within the rigid confines of this patriarchal world, women discovered a potent and often unexpected ally: their own voices. Music became a unique key, unlocking spaces for creativity, authority, and connection that were otherwise firmly closed to them. For medieval women, singing was never just an art. It was a form of navigation, a way to chart a course through the narrow channels of societal expectation, and at times to subtly challenge the very boundaries that defined their lives. Whether within the sacred walls of a convent, the refined atmosphere of a court, or the humble confines of a cottage, they used melody to assert their presence, express their inner worlds, and leave an indelible mark on the culture of their time. Within the cloistered silence of the convent, a remarkable form of freedom existed. Here, women could dedicate their lives to God, and in doing so, escape the traditional paths of marriage and motherhood. This sacred space also became a sanctuary for artistic and intellectual expression, and no one exemplifies this better than the towering figure of Hildegard of Bingen. A 12th century abbess, mystic, physician, and composer, Hildegard was a force of nature. Her musical compositions were nothing short of revolutionary. She wrote for her own community of nuns, crafting soaring, ecstatic hymns and liturgical dramas like the Ordo Virtutum, a full-length musical morality play. Her compositions defied the established conventions of Gregorian chant, where traditional chant was often restrained and followed strict melodic patterns. Hildegard's music was wildly expressive, leaping across vast vocal ranges with a passionate, almost uncontrollable energy that seemed to mirror her own visionary experiences. She believed her songs were divinely inspired, and this belief gave her the authority to step far beyond the usual limits placed on women. Through her music, she didn't just participate in worship, she shaped it, creating a powerful, auditory theology that allowed her and her sisters to experience their faith with a profound and unprecedented intensity. Her voice, channeled through her compositions, became a legitimate vehicle for spiritual leadership and theological exploration, proving that a woman's song could carry as much divine authority as any priest's sermon. Far from the quiet cloisters in the sun-drenched courts of southern France, another group of women found a different way to make themselves heard. The Troubadours, the female counterparts to the famous Troubadours, were often noble women who composed and performed songs of courtly love or finema. But they took this male-dominated genre and turned it inside out, using its conventions to express a distinctly female perspective. While a troubadour might sing of a distant, idealized lady, a Troubadours like the Countess of Dyer wrote from the perspective of that lady herself. In her famous song, A Chanta Emma de so quiu no volria, she doesn't pine away silently. Instead, she openly laments her unfaithful lover, boldly proclaiming her own worth and her right to feel anger and desire. She sings, "I should like to hold my knight/naked in my arms one evening," a line of stunning frankness that claims female desire as a valid subject for art. The Troubadours used the courtly love tradition not to remain silent objects of admiration, but to become active subjects of their own stories, negotiating the complex politics of love and power in a society that offered them little formal agency. Their songs were a sophisticated negotiation, a way to engage in intellectual and emotional discourse from within the safety of a poetic form. Beyond these famous names, however, lies the vast, quiet symphony of anonymous women whose music was the very bedrock of daily and domestic life. These were the countless mothers, grandmothers, and village women for whom music was a practical tool and a deep comfort. Their voices filled the home with lullabies, gentle melodies designed to soothe a frightened child to sleep in a world of darkness and uncertainty. Their voices rose in work songs, sung while spinning wool, weaving cloth, or working in the fields, rhythmic chants that made repetitive labor more bearable and synchronized the movements of a group, turning solitary tasks into shared experiences. These women were the guardians of oral tradition, preserving and passing down ballads, folk tales, and healing charms through song, ensuring that community history and collective wisdom survived from one generation to the next. Their contributions are largely absent from official historical records, but their musical legacy was no less vital. It was the essential soundtrack of survival and community, a testament to the quiet, persistent power of the female voice to sustain, comfort, and connect. Through these diverse avenues, the sacred compositions of the cloister, the courtly critiques of the Troubadours, and the domestic hum of the home medieval women demonstrated that music was a uniquely accessible form of power. It was a platform that could circumvent traditional barriers of literacy and social restriction. A woman who might never be allowed to preach from a pulpit could compose a hymn of breathtaking theological depth. A noblewoman who had no voice in political matters could craft a song that critiqued the behavior of the men around her. An ordinary woman, owning nothing of material value, could possess a vast repertoire of songs that held her family and community together. Their voices, often overlooked by the chroniclers of their time, were in fact essential threads in the rich tapestry of medieval sound, reminding us that history is heard not only in the grand fanfares of kings, but also in the resilient and enduring melodies of those who nurtured the world from the ground up. If the music of the royal court was a grand assertion of control and the songs of rebellion a cry for justice, then the soundscape of the Black Death was something else entirely, the raw, unfiltered sound of a world coming undone. Beginning in 1347 and raging for years, the plague did not just kill millions. It dismantled the very foundations of medieval society, shredding the bonds of family, faith, and community. In the face of such incomprehensible horror, where medicine and prayer alike seemed to fail, people turned to the one language that could possibly hold their terror and their hope. Music became an essential tool for navigating this new reality, serving two profound and seemingly contradictory purposes. It was a vessel for bottomless grief and a desperate lifeline for spiritual solace, often within the very same breath of a song. The most formal and enduring musical response to the plague came from within the church, giving voice to a collective cry for divine mercy. This was the era when the Dies Irae, or Day of Wrath, began to cement its place as one of the most powerful and terrifying sequences in the Requiem Mass. Its lyrics painted a vivid picture of the Day of Judgment, a world consumed by fire and trembling before the throne of God. For a population watching loved ones die gruesome deaths within days, these words were not abstract theology, they were a mirror of their daily reality. The melody that accompanied it was equally ominous, a slow, descending chant that felt like a musical descent into the grave itself. To sing the Dies Irae was to give voice to the apocalyptic fear that gripped Europe, to acknowledge the wrath of a god who seemed to have turned his back on his creation. Yet, in its very performance, this music also offered a strange comfort. By framing their suffering within a known liturgical tradition, people could contextualize the chaos. Their pain became part of a larger, divine narrative, a terrible but purposeful punishment that might, through acknowledgement and penance, eventually lead to redemption. The music provided a structure for their panic, a way to process the unprocessable through the familiar rhythms of ritual. But beyond the stone walls of the church, a different, more personal kind of music emerged from the homes and hearts of the common people. These were the anonymous folk songs and laments, passed down orally and rarely written, that expressed a more intimate and resilient form of grief. A mother rocking a feverish child might hum a fragmented, haunting melody, a wordless tune that held more sorrow than any formal liturgy could contain. Communities decimated by the plague developed songs that told the stories of specific losses, a whole village wiped out, a family lost in a single week preserving the memory of the dead in a world where mass graves often rendered them anonymous. These songs were stark, simple, and emotionally direct. They didn't speak of a final judgment but of immediate human emptiness. Yet, in their very existence, they were also acts of defiance. To create beauty, to craft a melody from the depths of despair, was to assert a flicker of humanity in the face of the plague's mindless destruction. This was music not as a plea to God, but as a testament to the living, a way to say, "We are still here and we remember." This desperate search for meaning and control also gave rise to one of the most extreme and sonic manifestations of the era's terror, the flagellant movements. These were groups of penitents who traveled from town to town, believing that the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins, and that only by inflicting extreme punishment upon themselves could they avert divine wrath. Their rituals were a brutal symphony of sound and movement. They would march in processions, chanting hymns in a stark, monotonous rhythm, their voices rising and falling in unison. This chanting served to hypnotize both the participants and the onlookers, building a collective trance state that enabled the horrifying act to follow. As their chanting reached a fever pitch, they would begin to scourge their own backs with whips embedded with metal spikes, the rhythmic cracking of the lashes and their cries of pain adding a gruesome percussion to the macabre performance. The entire terrifying spectacle, the rhythmic chanting, the synchronized movement, the brutal sound of the scourges was a frantic, performative attempt to control the uncontrollable. They believed that the perfect, painful harmony of their ritual could somehow cancel out the dissonant chaos of the plague and restore order to a broken world. The legacy of this period is a profound lesson in music's dual nature during times of immense trauma. The same melody could hold both paralyzing fear and a fragile hope. The Dies Irae allowed people to name their terror, while a folk lament allowed them to mourn their personal loss. Even the terrifying chant of the flagellants was, in its own way, a distorted form of prayer, an attempt to use rhythm and pain to bargain with a silent heaven. In the absence of effective cures or answers, music became the primary tool for a society trying to make sense of the senseless. It provided a structure for grief, a channel for fear, and a slender thread of connection between the living and the dead. It did not stop the plague, but it helped people endure it, proving that even in the deepest darkness, the human impulse to create meaning through sound remains one of our most powerful and enduring weapons against despair. Picture a world where every melody, every harmony, exists only for a fleeting moment dependent entirely on memory. vulnerable to the slightest change or the final breath of the one person who knew it by heart. This was the fragile reality of music for much of human history, a beautiful but ephemeral art. Then, something extraordinary happened. In the scriptoriums and churches of medieval Europe, a quiet revolution began to take shape, not with swords or declarations, but with ink and parchment. Monks started drawing small, cryptic marks above the sacred texts they were copying. These tiny signs, called neumes, were the humble beginning of a technology that would forever change the course of music. They were simple curves and dots, indicating only the general direction of a melody, whether the next note should go up or down. A rising curve might suggest a lift of the voice, a dot a subtle fall. It was a primitive memory aid, a series of clues for a singer who already knew the tune, utterly useless to anyone outside that specific oral tradition. Yet, within these modest scribbles lay the seed of an idea so powerful it would eventually give music a physical form, allowing it to be captured, owned, and controlled. The driving force behind this innovation was, perhaps unsurprisingly, the need for control and uniformity within the most powerful institution of the age, the Church. As Christianity spread across diverse regions, from the misty hills of Ireland to the sunny plains of Italy, a troubling problem emerged for church authorities. The same prayer, the same chant, was beginning to sound wildly different from one diocese to another. Local singers added their own flourishes, forgotten parts were replaced with new inventions, and the core liturgy was fracturing into countless regional dialects. To the centralizing power of the papacy, this was more than an aesthetic issue. It was a threat to doctrinal unity. How could the Church present itself as a single, universal body if its very voice was a cacophony of conflicting sounds? The solution was to find a way to standardize the singing, to ensure that a Gregorian chant in Paris sounded identical to the same chant in Prague. The answer lay in improving those little neumes. The journey from these basic reminders to a true written language for sound was slow, but a series of brilliant breakthroughs accelerated it dramatically. The single most important innovation was the introduction of the staff, a set of horizontal lines that created a visual grid for pitch. This is where we meet a pivotal figure, a monk named Guido d'Arezzo working in the 11th century. Guido didn't just add a line or two, he systematized the entire concept. He popularized the 4-line staff, and he gave each line and space a specific pitch value. Now a note could be placed on a specific line, and anyone, anywhere, could know exactly what pitch to sing without ever having heard the melody before. This was a monumental leap from vague gesture to precise instruction. Guido also had a clever teaching tool. He noticed that a popular hymn to St. John had a peculiar feature. Each successive line began on a higher note than the last. He took the first syllable of each line at re, mi, fa, sol, la, and turned them into the solfege syllables that millions of music students still use today. Suddenly, music was no longer just an oral tradition passed from master to student. It was a teachable science. A young boy with a good voice could learn to read complex chants in a fraction of the time it once took, breaking the monopoly of the few master singers who held all the music in their heads. This was the true birth of musical literacy, and its implications would ripple far beyond the monastery walls. With this new tool of precise notation, composers were suddenly unleashed. The most exciting and complex development was the rise of polyphony music with multiple, independent melodic lines woven together. Before notation, singing in harmony was a risky, improvisational affair. With notation, composers like Léonin and Pérotin at the Notre Dame School in Paris could meticulously craft breathtakingly complex works. They could write one melody for a soloist, a second, slower moving line for a supporting voice, and a third, foundational part held by the lowest voices. They could see these interlocking patterns on the page, experiment with them, and perfect them. Their massive, awe-inspiring organum compositions, with their spiraling vocal lines reaching towards the cathedral ceiling, were direct products of this new technology. Notation allowed music to become an architectural art, designed on parchment before it was ever heard in the air. It granted composers a form of immortality, allowing their creative visions to survive long after they were gone and to travel across continents to inspire others. For the first time, a musical idea could be truly owned, shared, and built upon by people who had never met. But just as this new technology empowered the creative spirit, it also created the means for its own suppression. The same written records that preserved a beautiful motet could also be used to enforce a rigid orthodoxy. Church authorities now had a definitive reference text. A bishop could walk into a church, open a beautifully illuminated antiphona, the book containing the notated chants, and demand that the local choir sing exactly what was on the page, purging any beloved local variations or folk influences that had crept in over the years. Written music became a tool of censorship, a way to standardize and sanitize the sonic landscape in the name of doctrinal purity. The power dynamic shifted. The authority of the written word began to outweigh the authority of local tradition and oral knowledge. A melody in a sanctioned book was correct. A melody only in someone's memory was now suspect, potentially heretical, and subject to correction or erasure. Yet the genie was out of the bottle. While the church used notation to consolidate its power, the technology itself was neutral and would soon be co-opted for entirely different purposes. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century was the final catalyst that turned musical notation from a tool of the elite into an engine of mass dissemination. Now, not only sacred motets but also secular songs, bawdy tavern ballads, and yes, even songs of protest and rebellion could be set in type, printed on cheap broadsheets, and distributed by the hundreds. A satirical song mocking a corrupt nobleman, once confined to a single tavern, could now be printed and carried by traveling merchants to a dozen towns. The tune could be learned exactly as the anonymous composer intended, its critical lyrics preserved perfectly without the risk of a misremembered word softening its punch. This was a game changer for Dissent. The rebellious rhythms we discussed earlier could now travel faster, farther, and with greater accuracy, uniting discontented people across a wider region with a shared, standardized musical manifesto. The story of musical notation is therefore a perfect paradox of the medieval world. It was born from a desire for control and gave that control to powerful institutions, yet it simultaneously invented the very mechanism that would allow the voices of rebellion to be amplified, preserved, and heard for centuries to come. It gave music a body, and in doing so, gave it both a chain and a weapon. While the grand cathedrals echoed with Gregorian chant and the courts resounded with complex polyphony, the vast majority of medieval people experienced a completely different soundtrack, one that rose not from stone vaults but from sun-baked fields, smoky taverns, and humble cottages. This was the world of folk music, the vibrant, living heartbeat of everyday life for the common man and woman. It was an art form born not of scholarly theory or royal decree, but of immediate necessity and shared emotion, giving voice to the experiences history books so often overlook. This music wasn't written down in precious songbooks. It was carried in the memory, passed from one generation to the next through the simple, powerful act of singing together. Each village, each valley, each region developed its own unique variations on common themes, creating a rich tapestry of local identity woven from melody and verse. A ballad about a lost love in England would have a different lilt and lyrical twist than the same story told in the hills of Bavaria, yet both would resonate with the same universal human feelings. This oral tradition made folk music incredibly resilient and adaptable, a true music of the people, by the people, and for the people. The connection between this music and the rhythms of daily survival was absolute. Life was governed by the relentless turning of the agricultural year, and folk songs provided the essential soundtrack to this cycle, transforming grueling labor into a shared, almost ritualistic endeavor. Consider the harvesting songs. The work of cutting and gathering grain with scythes and sickles was back-breaking, sun-scorched toil, but a field of workers didn't labor in silence. A lead singer, often the strongest voice or the most charismatic worker, would call out a line, and the rest would respond with a powerful, rhythmic chorus, their voices rising and falling in time with the swing of their blades. This call and response structure did more than just mark time. It synchronized the movements of the entire group, creating an efficient human machine. The driving rhythm made the work feel faster, the shared singing alleviated the crushing monotony, and the collective effort fostered a powerful sense of camaraderie, turning a collection of individuals into a single, purposeful community working toward a common goal. The music was a psychological tool as much as a practical one, a way to collectively push through exhaustion and find a sliver of joy in the midst of hardship. This integration of music into work extended far beyond the fields. In the dim, fire-lit interiors of homes during the long winter months, women gathered for the evenings to spin wool or flax into thread. This spinning was a tedious, solitary task, but it was rarely done alone. These spinning bees were social events, and they had their own repertoire of songs, spinning tunes that were often slower and more lyrical than the driving harvest songs, but no less important. As their hands performed the repetitive, hypnotic motions, their voices would weave tales of legendary heroes, tragic love affairs, or local gossip set to melody. These songs preserved community history, passed on moral lessons, and offered a vital space for female companionship and storytelling away from the ears of men. The music transformed a chore into an occasion, a moment of connection and cultural preservation that strengthened the social fabric one thread and one song at a time. But folk music was far more than just a tool for work. It was the central nervous system of community celebration and cultural identity. The medieval calendar was punctuated by seasonal festivals that offered a crucial release from the grind of daily life. May Day, Midsummer, Harvest Home, and the rowdy, topsy-turvy celebrations of Plough Monday and Carnival. Each of these events was defined by its own unique music and dance. On May Day, villages would erupt with the sound of pipes and drums as people danced around the maypole, their steps following intricate, traditional patterns that celebrated the return of spring and fertility. During the midwinter festivities, wassailing songs would be sung as groups went door to door, offering a song in exchange for a drink or a bit of food, a practice that blended merrymaking with a form of communal charity. These festivals, with their specific songs and dances, created a shared cultural vocabulary. Everyone knew the steps to the common dance. Everyone could join in the chorus of the familiar carol. This active, communal participation reinforced a sense of belonging and shared history, binding the community together across generations. Perhaps most importantly, this grassroots musical culture was profoundly democratic. It didn't require a royal patron, a formal education, or even the ability to read music. The only requirement was participation. A ploughman with a strong voice could be as valued as any court minstrel within the context of his village. A grandmother's vast memory for old ballads made her a living library, a keeper of tradition. this music gave a platform to the voiceless, allowing them to comment on their world, celebrate their joys, and lament their struggles in their own authentic voice. The songs that have survived, collected by folklorists centuries later, offer us a priceless window into the minds and hearts of ordinary medieval people, their wit, their resilience, their fears, and their hopes. They remind us that the true soul of the Middle Ages wasn't found solely in the splendor of a cathedral or the intrigue of a royal court, but also in the simple, powerful harmony of a community singing together under the open sky, finding strength and solace in the shared soundtrack of their lives. This profound connection between music and the divine wasn't just a feeling, it was a complete philosophical system, a way of understanding the universe itself. At the very heart of this medieval world, you sat the revolutionary ideas of a 6th century Roman scholar named Boethius. Even centuries after his death, his book, De Institution Musica, became the foundational text for every serious musical thinker in the Middle Ages. Boethius proposed a breathtakingly elegant concept that the entire cosmos was structured according to musical principles, a perfect, inaudible harmony. He then divided all of music into 3 distinct but interconnected categories, creating a framework that would justify everything from monastic chant to royal fanfares for the next 1,000 years. The first and grandest of these categories was musica mundana, the music of the universe itself. This was the celestial harmony produced by the majestic, perpetual motion of the heavenly spheres, the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars. Medieval thinkers believed that as these colossal bodies journeyed across the sky, their movements generated a sublime and perfect music, a continuous chord of creation that was the very sound of divine order. Of course, this music was inaudible to human ears. Its perfection was simply too vast, too pure for our earthly senses to perceive, but its existence was an article of faith. Musica mundana was the reason the seasons changed in a reliable cycle, why the tides ebbed and flowed, and why the cosmos didn't descend into chaos. It was the mathematical and musical blueprint underlying all of reality, a constant, silent symphony conducted by God. The second category, musica humana, brought this cosmic concept down to a deeply personal level. This was the music of the human being, the invisible harmony that should exist between our body and our soul. Just as the planets moved in a balanced, ordered relationship to one another, so too should the different parts of our human nature. Our rational mind, our passionate emotions, and our physical body were meant to be in a state of perfect tuning, like the strings of a well-crafted instrument. When a person was healthy, virtuous, and at peace, their musica humana was in perfect harmony. But when they fell into sin, illness, or emotional turmoil, they fell out of tune with themselves and by extension with the harmony of the cosmos itself. This is why music was considered such a powerful force for healing. A physician or a monk prescribing a specific chant was essentially attempting to retune a patient's disordered musica humana, using audible sound to realign them with the perfect, inaudible music of the spheres. Finally, there was musica instrumentalis, the only one of the 3 that we would actually recognize as music today. This was the practical, audible music produced by voices, strings, winds, and percussion. But to the medieval mind, this was the least of the 3 types, merely a faint, earthly echo of the far grander harmonies of the universe and the soul. Its entire purpose and its value were derived from its ability to point the listener toward those higher, purer forms of music. A beautifully sung Gregorian chant was valuable not merely because it was pleasant, but because its mathematical proportions and pure intervals mirrored the perfect ratios governing the movement of the planets. It was a bridge, a sonic ladder that could, if performed and received with the right intention, elevate the soul from the mundane world of sound toward an apprehension of the divine order. This framework made every musical performance a potentially spiritual act, an opportunity to participate momentarily in the harmony of the cosmos. This lofty ideal, however, was not without its tensions. Even the most revered church fathers grappled with a fundamental anxiety about this powerful art form. Saint Augustine, in his famous Confessions, confessed to being deeply troubled by his own love for the beautiful melodies used in worship. He worried that the sensual pleasure of the music, the sheer beauty of the sound, could distract him from the sacred meaning of the words being sung. He feared he might be more moved by the voice of the singer than by the message from God, prioritizing earthly delight over spiritual edification. This ambivalence reveals a keen understanding of music's dangerous, double-edged power. It could indeed elevate the soul toward heaven, but it could also tug the heart back toward the baser pleasures of the flesh. The medieval church never fully resolved this tension. Instead, it constantly walked a tightrope, cautiously embracing the immense power of musica instrumentalis as a divine tool, while remaining wary of its ability to seduce and corrupt. Ultimately, the Boethian view won the day, framing music not as a frivolous entertainment but as a serious science, a spiritual discipline, and an essential pathway for humanity to seek its proper place within the grand, harmonious design of God's creation. But beyond the sacred and the rebellious, music also served a third master in the Middle Ages' sheer, unadulterated spectacle. In the glittering world of the aristocracy, a noble's power was measured not just in land and soldiers, but in his ability to create an atmosphere of intoxicating splendor. Every feast, every tournament, every carefully orchestrated romantic pursuit was a multi-sensory performance, and music was the invisible director, setting the stage, guiding the emotions, and broadcasting a message of immense refinement and control. This was entertainment as a strategic weapon, a form of soft power designed to dazzle rivals, secure alliances, and cement one's status at the very pinnacle of a fiercely competitive social world. Imagine yourself as an honored guest arriving at a great baronial hall for a midwinter feast. Before you even taste a morsel of food, you are enveloped by a wall of sound. From a high wooden gallery, a consort of musicians, perhaps a soft-voiced lute, a gently plucked harp, and a sweet-toned recorder, weaves a tapestry of intricate melodies. This is not background noise, it is a calculated part of the hospitality, designed to soothe the mind and elevate the spirit after a long journey. As the countless courses begin to arrive, spiced wines, roasted swans presented in full plumage, elaborate sugar sculptures called subtleties, the music subtly shifts to accompany the spectacle. A fanfare of trumpets might announce the arrival of the most prestigious dish, the Lord's personal musicians playing a distinctive theme that marks his generosity and wealth for all to hear. Between courses, the music provides the foundation for other artistic displays. A court poet might step forward to recite a new verse composed in honor of the host, his words rhythmically declaimed over the gentle strumming of a lute, intertwining the arts of poetry and music into a single, flattering tribute. The goal is to overwhelm the senses, to create an experience so luxurious and culturally sophisticated that guests leave not just well-fed, but profoundly impressed, carrying tales of their host's magnificence back to their own courts. The music made the opulence resonate, transforming material wealth into an audible form of cultural authority. The following morning, the soundscape shifts dramatically from refined elegance to thunderous pageantry as the court moves to the tournament field. Here, music takes on a more muscular, heroic role. The air crackles with the urgent, piercing blasts of heralds' trumpets, each distinct call signaling a different phase of the combat: the call to assemble, the charge, the retreat. These were the battlefield commands of the chivalric world, and their sound instantly galvanized the crowd and the participants alike, creating a focused, anticipatory tension. As two armored knights thunder towards each other, lances couched, the roar of the crowd is punctuated by the rhythmic beating of drums, mimicking the furious heartbeat of the combat and driving the excitement to a fever pitch. During the lulls in the action, minstrels stationed near the pavilions of the great lords perform rousing ballads. These are not simple tunes, they are musical chronicles that glorify the knightly ideal, singing of legendary feats of strength, unwavering courage, and devout chivalry. By linking the real, muddy combat happening in the lists to these mythical, sung-about heroes, the music elevates the tournament from a violent sport into a living drama of aristocratic virtue. The knight fighting in the field isn't just winning a prize, he is performing a chapter of his own heroic story, with the music serving as its epic soundtrack, ensuring his valor is remembered and celebrated. And then, as evening falls and the court retreats to more private chambers, the music transforms once more, becoming the language of intimate aspiration and complex social negotiation. This is the realm of courtly love, or finema, and its soundtrack is the quiet, intricate music of the troubadour and the Troubadours. A single lute or viol provides the accompaniment as a singer pours out verses of idealized, often unrequited, passion for a beloved lady. These songs, however, were rarely just about personal emotion. They were a highly stylized social game, a way to demonstrate one's refinement, wit, and understanding of complex aristocratic codes. To compose or commission a song of courtly love was to show that you possessed not just wealth, but courtoisie, the manners, education, and emotional sensitivity that defined a true noble. The content of the songs often blurred the lines between genuine feeling and political allegory. A knight singing of his devoted service to a distant, perfect lady might also be subtly signaling his loyalty to a powerful patron or a faction at court. The lady, often married to another, represented the ultimate unattainable goal, a metaphor for the constant striving for perfection, favor, and social advancement that defined life in these competitive circles. The music provided a safe, accepted vocabulary for discussing desire, power, and loyalty, allowing the aristocracy to explore the tensions of their own social world under the graceful disguise of romantic poetry and melody. In every one of these settings, the feast, the tournament, the courtly soiree, music was performing a double duty. On the surface, it provided amusement, excitement, and beauty. But just beneath, it was engaged in the serious business of power politics. A lord who could afford the largest and most skilled ensemble of musicians was making a clear statement about his resources. A patron who commissioned a complex new polyphonic work from a renowned composer like Guillaume de Machaut was investing in cultural capital, showcasing his court as a center of innovation and sophistication that could outshine his rivals. The music created an environment that attracted the best knights, the most desirable alliances, and the most talented artists. It built a reputation. In the relentless theater of aristocratic life, where every gesture was scrutinized, music was the most versatile and persuasive actor on the stage, capable of whispering of love, shouting of glory, and above all, singing an unwavering ballad of its patron's supreme and unassailable right to lead. For centuries, the power of musical dissent had been constrained by the human voice and the fragile chain of memory. A protest song might ignite a village, but its journey to the next town relied on the uncertain path of a traveling minstrel or the whispered repetition of a merchant. Its potency could fade with a forgotten verse or a misremembered lyric, its critical edge softened by time and distance. This all changed with one of the most transformative inventions in human history. In the mid-15th century, Johannes Gutenberg's development of movable type printing didn't just revolutionize the spread of text. It fundamentally rewired the circulatory system of ideas, and music was swept along in this powerful new current. The printing press gave melody a permanent, portable body, and in doing so, it handed a powerful new weapon to the voices of dissent that had always simmered beneath the surface of medieval society. The most immediate and explosive impact was the rise of the broadside ballad. These were single, large sheets of paper, cheaply printed on one side, featuring the lyrics of a song, often set to a well-known, familiar tune, and topped with a crude woodcut illustration. They were the social media of their day, produced quickly and sold for a penny on street corners, in taverns, and at market squares. For the first time, a satirical song mocking a corrupt local official or a greedy landowner wasn't just a fleeting moment of rebellion. It was a physical object that could be bought, sold, hidden, shared, and pasted on a wall. A minstrel could now learn a protest song directly from a printed sheet, ensuring that the composer's original, pointed lyrics were preserved perfectly, without the risk of a watered-down or censored version being passed along orally. The tune itself might be old and comforting, but the words could be razor-sharp and dangerously new, allowing subversive ideas to Trojan horse their way into the public consciousness, wrapped in a melody everyone already knew and loved. This newfound ability to standardize and spread musical criticism was a nightmare for those in power. Before print, a bishop or noble could silence a critical singer in one town, hoping the song would die with him. Now, a single printed edition of a ballad could be run off in hundreds of copies in a few hours, bundled into a peddler's pack, and disseminated across an entire region before the authorities even knew it existed. Trying to suppress a popular printed song was like trying to stamp out a dandelion gone to seed. Crushing one copy only seemed to spread 100 more. These printed ballads began to create what historians call a nascent public sphere, a shared space outside of the control of the church or crown, where ordinary people could encounter and debate ideas about power, justice, and morality. The communal singing of a printed ballad in a tavern became an act of solidarity and a rehearsal for dissent, uniting strangers around a shared grievance set to a common rhythm. We can see this powerful effect in action during the great religious and political upheavals of the 16th century, particularly the Protestant Reformation. Reformers like Martin Luther were masterful propagandists who understood that complex theological arguments needed to be translated into a language and a melody that the common person could grasp. Luther himself wrote hymns like "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," which became stirring anthems for the movement. But more importantly, the Protestant cause was fueled by a flood of printed songbooks and pamphlets containing polemical hymns and satirical ballads that mocked the Pope and the Catholic clergy as corrupt and fraudulent. These printed songs became a crucial tool for building a collective identity among disparate groups of reformers, giving them a shared musical repertoire that reinforced their new beliefs and strengthened their resolve in the face of persecution. The message was no longer locked in a Latin text in a monastery library. It was set to a catchy tune on a cheap sheet of paper, and it was spreading like wildfire. This technological shift marked a definitive turning point, catapulting music from its traditional roles of healing, worship, and courtly entertainment into its modern role as a formidable engine for mass communication and radical social change, proving that a melody could now mobilize a continent. Yet for all the distinct musical worlds we've explored, the sacred chants of the monastery, the rebellious ballads of the peasantry, the opulent fanfares of the court, none of them developed in a vacuum. The common image of an isolated, fortress-like Europe is a myth, especially when we listen closely to its soundscape. Medieval Europe was in fact a vibrant crossroads, a place where sounds, ideas, and instruments flowed along the same trade routes that carried silk, spices, and scholarship. This was an era of profound cross-cultural exchange, and the music of the time absorbed these influences in ways that would forever alter its course, transforming it from a purely local art into a rich, hybrid tapestry woven with threads from across the known world. Nowhere is this musical conversation more vivid than in the story of Al-Andalus, the sophisticated Islamic kingdom that flourished on the Iberian Peninsula for centuries. Here, in cities like Cordoba, Seville, and Granada, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian musicians lived in a rare, though complex, state of coexistence known as convivencia. In the opulent courts of Moorish caliphs, music was revered as a science, a branch of mathematics and philosophy, and its practitioners developed a level of theoretical and technical sophistication that dazzled their northern neighbors. When Christian nobles from places like Castile and Aragon visited these courts, either as diplomats, traders, or during the slow process of the Reconquista, they weren't just encountering a foreign culture, they were hearing the future of their own music. They were captivated by instruments they had never seen before, like the oud, a short-necked, pear-shaped lute with a warm, resonant tone that seemed to carry the very essence of the desert within its strings. This instrument didn't just visit, it stayed. Christian musicians adopted it, adapted it, and it slowly evolved into the lute that would become the quintessential instrument of the European Renaissance court, its very shape a permanent reminder of its Middle Eastern origins. But the exchange went far deeper than just instruments. It seeped into the very DNA of the music itself. Moorish and North African musical traditions introduced European ears to new melodic scales and modes, patterns of notes that felt distinctly different from the familiar church modes. These new scales often featured smaller, more fluid intervals and ornate, curling melodic embellishments that evoked a sense of passionate longing and profound emotion. This unique sound, which we might now associate with flamenco or certain forms of Arabic music, began to infuse the compositions of Spanish musicians, adding a new layer of expressive depth and complexity. Even the concept of polyphony itself, the interweaving of multiple independent melodic lines that became Europe's great musical innovation, may have been encouraged by hearing the complex, layered rhythmic and melodic patterns of Andalusian music. This wasn't a simple case of copying, it was a creative spark, a new way of thinking about how sounds could interact, ignited by contact with a different musical philosophy. This flow of sonic ideas wasn't confined to the Iberian Peninsula. Thousands of miles away, the Crusades, for all their violence and tragedy, became another unlikely vector for musical exchange. European knights and soldiers who marched to the Holy Land spent years, sometimes decades, immersed in the cultural environment of the Near East. They heard the powerful, nasal call of the zurna oboe and the driving, complex rhythms of Middle Eastern drums, used in everything from military signals to public celebrations. While many undoubtedly dismissed these sounds as alien, others were clearly intrigued. They brought descriptions and likely even a few instruments back home with them. The percussive energy and exotic tonalities of Eastern music began to seep into the European imagination, often showing up in the margins, in the lively dances of minstrels, in the more rhythmically daring compositions of secular music, and even in the musical depictions of the East in mystery plays, where a certain melodic exoticism was used to signal a foreign setting. These returning crusaders, therefore, didn't just bring back relics and scars, they brought back new sounds that expanded the palette of what was musically possible. This global dimension forces us to completely reconsider what we mean by medieval music, that haunting, healing Gregorian chant, Its development was influenced by the scholarship of Islamic and Jewish thinkers who were themselves preserving and expanding upon the ancient Greek theories of music and mathematics. That rebellious, driving rhythm in a peasant dance, it might unknowingly echo the complex polyrhythms of North Africa, the very instruments that defined royal splendor, like the lute and the ancestor of the violin, the rebec, were imports, technological and artistic gifts from other cultures. This means that the music we've been exploring throughout this video was never a pure, isolated European invention. It was a dynamic, ever-changing conversation, a constant process of borrowing, adapting, and blending. The rebellious spirit of a ballad and the healing power of a chant were both capable of absorbing innovative ideas from abroad, making medieval music a truly global phenomenon centuries before the term globalization was ever coined. To listen to it now is to hear the echoes of a world that was far more connected and far more curious than we often give it credit for. It might seem like a vast leap from the stone cloisters of a medieval monastery to the glowing screen of a smartphone, but the connection is more direct than you might think. Consider the modern mindfulness movement and the countless apps offering guided meditation. What is the first thing they often use to help you focus, quiet your mind, and achieve a state of calm? A slow, resonant, drone-like tone or a simple, repetitive melody. This is the direct descendant of the Gregorian chant prescription. The monks understood intuitively what neuroscience now confirms, that certain sonic patterns can dramatically alter our brainwave states, lowering stress hormones and guiding us into a place of deep relaxation. They were the original biohackers, using the human voice as their technology to recalibrate the human spirit. Today, we've simply swapped the monastic choir for a digital audio file, but the intended effect on our harried, modern minds is precisely the same. We are still using sound as a deliberate tool to heal the fractures within ourselves, seeking that same harmony between body and soul that the physicians of the Middle Ages called musica humana. And what of the rebellious spirit we heard in the ballads of the Peasants' Revolt? That flame has never been extinguished. It has simply found new kindling. Every protest march that has ever snaked through city streets, from the civil rights movement to anti-war demonstrations to the calls for climate action, has been powered by its own soundtrack. The specific instruments may have changed: an acoustic guitar instead of a lute, a megaphone instead of an unaccompanied voice, but the fundamental purpose is identical. Songs like "We Shall Overcome" or "Blowin' in the Wind" function exactly like the Song of the Husbandman. They give a collective voice to shared grievances. They forge solidarity among strangers united by a common cause, and they turn a list of complaints into a memorable, emotionally potent anthem that can be learned and shared by everyone. This musical strategy for mobilization, perfected in medieval town squares, remains one of the most powerful tools for social change. It transforms abstract injustice into a shared feeling, a rhythm you can march to, a melody that binds a movement together and makes its message impossible to ignore. Even the most opulent displays of state power still lean on the medieval playbook of sonic splendor. When a head of state arrives for a formal visit, they are not greeted with silence. They are met with a precisely timed fanfare, a performance of the national anthem, and the crisp, commanding rhythms of a military march. This is the direct legacy of the royal trumpeters who announced the arrival of a monarch, the complex polyphony of a court composer like Machaut, written to impress visiting dignitaries. The goal is unchanged: to use music to construct an aura of authority, tradition, and unshakable legitimacy. The grandeur of a modern orchestral performance for a national celebration taps into that same desire to overwhelm the senses and inspire awe. much like the colossal sound of a cathedral organ, was meant to represent the very voice of divine power. We may have replaced the crown with a different symbol of authority, but we still use the same sonic tools to crown it. This enduring legacy matters because it teaches us that our relationship with music is not merely recreational, it is foundational. The next time you put on a playlist to get through a difficult workout, you are tapping into the same rhythmic drive that synchronized medieval laborers in a field. When you listen to a sad song to process a heartbreak, you are engaging in a form of emotional healing that a medieval physician would have recognized immediately. And when you feel a surge of pride hearing your country's anthem at an international sporting event, you are participating in a ritual of communal identity that would feel intimately familiar to a subject in a medieval kingdom. Understanding this deep history enriches every note we hear. It reveals that music is our oldest and most reliable technology for navigating the human experience, a tool for healing our deepest wounds, challenging the most entrenched injustices, and creating moments of breathtaking beauty that connect us to something larger than ourselves. The melodies have evolved, the instruments have transformed, but the core purposes resonate across the centuries, reminding us that every chord we strike today is part of a conversation that began 1,000 years ago. From the quiet solace of the monastic infirmary to the thunderous chaos of the battlefield, from the humble peasant's cottage to the glittering king's court, we have traced the incredible journey of medieval music and uncovered its profound, tangible power. It was never merely entertainment or a simple diversion. It was a vital, active force that shaped the very fabric of daily existence, mending broken spirits, giving voice to the silenced, and crafting the aura of divinity around the powerful. This exploration reveals that sound was a fundamental technology of the human experience, as crucial to medieval life as the loom, the plough, or the sword. We have witnessed how a carefully prescribed Gregorian chant was considered as potent a medicine as any herb, a sonic bomb intended to realign the soul and body with the harmonious order of the cosmos. We have stood with the rebels of 1381, hearing their voices rise in unison, their ballads of injustice forging a collective courage that shook the foundations of feudal England. And we have been immersed in the overwhelming splendor of a royal coronation, where the combined might of choir, organ, and trumpet didn't just celebrate power, it actively constructed it, convincing all present of a king's divine right to rule through sheer, awe-inspiring auditory grandeur. As this journey concludes, I invite you to listen to the music in your own life with these ancient echoes in mind. That playlist you turn to after a difficult day, seeking comfort and calm. You are engaging in a modern form of sonic healing, a direct descendant of the monastic infirmary, the protest anthem you hear at a rally, uniting a crowd with a shared message of change. It carries the same rebellious DNA as the songs sung by medieval peasants in a tavern, the national anthem played at a solemn ceremony, stirring feelings of pride and unity. It operates on the very same principles of auditory propaganda that medieval monarchs used to command loyalty and awe. Every melody we create, share, and cherish is part of a vast historical continuum. Every chord we strike resonates with centuries of meaning, power, and purpose. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the medieval soundscape. If these ancient harmonies have given you a new perspective on the power of music, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share which of these facets, healing, rebellion, or splendor, resonates most with your own experience. And if you're eager for more journeys into the fascinating corners of the past, be sure to subscribe. Until next time, may the music in your life continue to comfort, inspire,